History man? A word burger, please. Tears.
Sequels, prequels, remakes, and reboots might often feel like a modern trend in movies, especially with studios more than eager to milk out existing properties for as much money as possible. But the idea of continuing stories or exploring new tales with revered characters is actually an ancient tradition. Sadly, the only difference now is almost 9 out of 10 of these continuations turn out to be a load of crap. Luckily, that wasn't the case with George Miller's Mad Max films. I mean, dude is almost 80 years old, and somehow he's still got that kick in him. Even if the franchise has suffered quite a few bouts of being stuck in developmental hell, Miller's Mad Max saga still aims to keep these age-old storytelling traditions alive, rather than conforming to the modern way of making a serialized narrative. Ironically, that wasn't always the plan, as the original Mad Max movie from 1979 was partly inspired by popular trends at the time, which were mostly dominated by biker and vigilante movies. But by the time Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior, came out in 1981, Miller and his team were more focused on turning Mad Max into a modern myth, rather than just another series with a straightforward linear plot. However, the way audiences watch these movies has led to some confusion, especially when actors return in new roles or, as in the case of the latest film, Furiosa, don't return at all. In Furiosa, Miller cleverly addresses this by introducing the character of History Man, a person responsible for preserving the past in this dystopian hell, blending facts with legends and passing it on to the world that is to come. Now, you might think that the most important character in the Mad Max movies is Max Rokitansky, Imperator Furiosa, or even the villains like Immortan Joe, Lord Humongous, or even Dementus. Well, sorry to break it to you, but in this lore, it's actually the tattooed old man we see in Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. The world of Mad Max is a complicated and murky one, often leaving even die-hard fans scratching their heads. With the fast-paced action and a surprisingly deep backstory, the Mad Max universe can be tricky to fully understand, especially with the order of the story and all. This is where the History Man comes in. But why exactly are these old guys so important? Without wasting another moment, let's find out. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
The fifth rider of the apocalypse.
Who are the History Men? The History Men, a group of historians who record what happened to the world after the fall of civilization. I think the first History Man we saw in the Mad Max saga was an old woman named Miss Giddy, a heavily tattooed woman who taught Immortan Joe's captive wives about the past through the art on her body. Like her, the History Men and women collect and share lost knowledge, helping to spread it among the people of the wasteland. They have different ways of displaying this knowledge, but the most noticeable is by tattooing historical words onto their skin in order to turn themselves into word burgers. For those who don't know, a word burger is what the History Men call the detailed background information they provide within the living narrative. The term was first introduced in the Mad Max Fury Road comic book miniseries in 2015. It was later brought to life in the 2024 prequel, Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. After the fall of civilization, books were burned and much of the world's knowledge was lost. In the chaos that followed, younger generations had to rely on older people, both men and women, who became history men, to teach them about the past and give context to things, objects, and ideas of the old world that were slowly fading away. The history men mostly operated out of the Citadel, which, after Immortan Joe's defeat, became a center of hope and learning in the wasteland. People say that after Furiosa took down Joe's tyrannical regime, it was the history men who shared their knowledge and helped the wretched build the town at the base of the Citadel. When Fury Road was released, people believed that the concept of history men emerged after Furiosa and Max successfully overthrew Immortan Joe's regime, but they existed much before that, as we see in Furiosa. Dementus always kept a history man caged up with him, just in case he needed to clear up some confusion by using a word burger. Now, all the Mad Max films already had a narrator, but it wasn't until the comic book miniseries that we really understand who history men are. These guys are not exactly in anyone's team. They remain neutral and retell everything that's happening around them in order to do their bit to pass their learned knowledge to the upcoming generation. Even at the end of Fury Road, a mysterious message from the first history man appears, where he asks, "Where must we go? We who wander this wasteland in search of our better selves." According to George Miller, these history men are the only way that culture and information are preserved and shared, since the internet and books no longer exist. Even in Furiosa, we hear someone narrating bits, and that's actually done by the history man. In a way, the importance of a history man's body art in the series basically highlights the need to retell history to prevent repeating the same mistakes. We see it happen even in the comics, which practically begin and end with a history man narrating the entire story. In the Mad Max Fury comic titled Nux and Immortan Joe, it's a history man who starts talking about how Nux became a war boy as an infant after losing both his parents to the unforgiving life of the Citadel. This history man holds the last remnants of the world before the fall and talks about how the world turned harsh and inhuman after civilization crumbled, reducing everyone into mere bodies trying to survive the cruelty of the wasteland. In the second part of the comic, this history man also foretells the rise of Colonel Joe into the tyrant we know as Immortan, the man who cheated death. We find out how Joe and his henchmen went from celebrated military men to dictators who raped, pillaged, plundered, and killed their way into power. He tells us how Joe, Major Kalashnikov, and Deep Dog met the People Eater, who took the colonel and his gang to the Citadel when it was being defended by the Roughnecks. From one of his wordburgers, we get to know that after losing a lot of men while trying to climb the fortress and being cornered in a scorching desert by the Roughnecks, Joe took inspiration from the tale of a Persian general named Tanaji Malusari, who won the Battle of Sinagad by using a monitor lizard to climb up the fortress. In a similar manner, Joe comes up with a plan to climb to the top of the fortress by sending a monitor lizard up with his men tied to a rope attached to the lizard, allowing them to scale the walls. At first, the lizard keeps coming back down, until one of Joe's henchmen cuts off his own finger and attaches it to the rope as a treat to motivate the lizard to reach the top. This allows Joe and his men to start climbing. However, the plan goes wrong when most of Joe's followers are killed, and the fortress inhabitants begin executing the survivors and hanging their bodies from the cliff walls. Many of Joe's remaining followers on the ground, believing he's dead, lose hope, prepare to leave by the dawn of the third day. However, Joe re-emerges with a few of his remaining followers, having somehow defeated all the defenders. His followers, amazed by this nearly impossible victory, start calling him Immortal, which eventually evolves into the name Immortan Joe. After becoming the most powerful man in all of the wasteland, the fortress becomes known as the Citadel and serves as Joe's base of operations. His men begin working the oil refinery and lead mine they discovered earlier, producing oil and bullets. The oil refinery is later named Gastown, and the fat man who first told Joe about the fortress becomes its leader. On the other hand, the lead mine is named as the Bullet Farm, with Joe's second-in-command Kalashnikov, who later comes to be known as the Bullet Farmer, taking charge. The history man also explains how Joe had 3 sons, Scrotus, Rictus Erectus, and Corpus Callosum, who were either deranged, mentally challenged, or deformed. This pushed Joe to develop a plan to father healthy sons who could carry on his legacy. So he began using various women as his wives, keeping them isolated in a biodome from the harsh elements of the wasteland to increase the chances of having healthy heirs. Throughout the comic, the history man dictates the entire story to the children of the wretched like it was a bedtime tale of horror. We see the same thing being repeated in Mad Max Fury Road, Furiosa, where a different history man talks about how Furiosa met the 5 wives of Immortan Joe and decided to help the escape. Basically, all you need to know is that a history man is a living, breathing archive of all the horrors that have been happening at the heart of the wasteland, and the stories he seems to narrate are probably from a future where the world is recovering from the blows it suffered by being under such unforgiving tyrants. The first on-screen history man was seen in Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. The Furiosa prequel heavily imposes on the fact that after the fall, the history man is seen as the last link to the lost world. The history man we see in the film is a part of Dementus' biker horde, having been captured by them and kept in a cage. Dementus often turns to him for explanations and poetic word-burgers to describe situations, often relying on his knowledge to comprehend certain predicaments. Unlike everyone else around him, in the film, we see how the history man is not a killer or a fighter, but a storyteller. But this history man seemed like a kind old guy who saw potential in young Furiosa as someone who could carry on his knowledge and thus encouraged her to make herself indispensable to Dementus. During the 40-day Wasteland War, the history man managed to escape from Dementus and his biker horde and eventually joined Immortan Joe's forces at the Citadel. While still on the battlefield, he witnessed Furiosa's charge to exact revenge on Dementus. When Scabrous Scrotus asked about her, the history man described her as the darkest of angels and the 5th rider of the apocalypse. After Furiosa returned back to the Citadel at the end of the war, he narrated that some were dissatisfied with the simple idea that she killed Dementus by shooting him once after he tried to talk his way out. According to these people, they believe she ended him in more fitting ways, mirroring how he'd once killed her mother, Mary Jabassa, or her lover, Praetorian Jack, in front of her eyes. However, the history man claimed that Furiosa had personally told him that she brought Dementus' body back to the Citadel and planted a peach seed from the green place that was once given to her by her mother. She planted it inside him, growing a peach tree from his flesh while his body acted as a living fertilizer for the plant. Furiosa ends with a montage of scenes from Fury Road, which at first seems like a straightforward way to connect the two movies. But when paired with the history man's admittedly unreliable narration, these scenes actually cast a lot of doubt on what we thought we knew about Fury Road. I know that might sound unsettling, but you have to understand that confusion is a key element of the Mad Max world. Sure, it's a universe thrown into chaos, but it's not without hope. Hope is found through stories that bring meaning to the chaos, whether it's the justice of a woman taking down her tormentor in the desert or the hope of transforming him into something that can nourish others. These stories, and the concept of how it's been narrated through a history man, show us how, in life, we interpret narratives based on what we need at the moment. It's less about one absolute truth or canon, and more about the stories we tell to make sense of our own history and present.
Maggots debriding his necrotic flesh.
Are history men a reliable source of information? As you might have figured it out by now, the history men's way of keeping the records of all the events that are happening around them is not exactly perfect. Even if they tattooed their entire bodies with information, they're prone to misremembering and misrepresenting things. This is something to keep in mind when thinking about anything that happens in the Mad Max movies, which also includes the ending of Furiosa. The focus on misremembering and mythology in the Mad Max series basically highlights a key idea about how we interpret art. Whether it's a post-apocalyptic road movie or something else, understanding art always allows for personal interpretations because, come on, there's never just one explanation that covers all possibilities. At the end, after hearing the many deaths of Dementus, the history man talks about how Furiosa took Dementus to the Citadel and buried him alive in the soil to plant a seed from her home in the green place within him. And as bizarre as that sounds, nobody questions him, simply because he is the history man who claimed that Furiosa herself had confided in him. Through the history man, the film gives a powerful yet poetic justice to its main villain, whose life ends by bringing new life instead of taking it. Now, you and I both know that the history man's claim is not very possible, but still it contains both beauty and salvation. He basically brings hope through his stories, especially in a world that's almost lost it. The peach tree symbolizes a hopeful future, breaking the cycle of violence, suffering, and revenge that once shaped Furiosa. The tree represents the legacy of her cherished green place, living on in the Citadel, a place that she refuses to call home. But again, this tree ending is just one of several possibilities the history man shares. In a simpler version, Furiosa merely shoots Dementus in the head, ending his life in the desert. Another version has her dragging him behind her vehicle, forcing him to endure the same fate he inflicted on others, including Furiosa's one true love, Praetorian Jack. Yet another account suggests she hangs Dementus on the same cross he used to torture her mother, Mary Jabassa. But when the history man claims that the peach tree punishment is the true ending, he admits that this is just what Furiosa told him, which means he didn't witness it himself. This basically highlights the subjective nature of storytelling, where personal experiences and desires shape the narrative. The history man even mentions that some people prefer the more brutal endings, like Furiosa using her car or the cross to exact revenge. And who's to say that Furiosa or the history man believe the tree ending is true just because it's the one they like the most? Plus, the history man's subjective nature is evident early in the film as well. When he first met Furiosa, he encouraged her to become a history man herself and demonstrated his own usefulness by defining words for Dementus and proclaiming the warlord's might when introducing him to his enemies. Throughout Furiosa, the history man serves as the main interpreter of events, which is really an example of how the meaning of the story is deeply tied to personal opinions and desires of those who narrate it.
History man? A word burger, please.
Why are history men important in the Mad Max franchise? Now that Immortan Joe has been taken down, without the history men's lessons, there's nothing to stop the Citadel from falling under the control of another tyrant in the future. The saying, "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it," rings true here, especially in a dystopian world where everyone is struggling to survive. Whether the history men will succeed in preventing the mistakes that led to Joe's rise remains to be seen. However, Furiosa's support for sharing history and her rise as the symbol of hope at the end of Fury Road and its prequel suggests that she might be a more benevolent leader, aiming to break the cycle of violence and power struggles in this godforsaken world. After all, George Miller has made it clear that Furiosa could easily become as ruthless as Immortan Joe, because his world of Mad Max doesn't offer a place for hero worship. It's important to note that both Max and Furiosa are deeply flawed characters. This idea can be further reinforced in the way Miller portrayed Aunt Entity's morally complex role in Beyond Thunderdome. Even though the Road Warrior removed any sympathetic backstory for Lord Humongous, the History Men's efforts to prevent the next generation from repeating Furiosa or Fury Road's violence highlight the Mad Max universe's intricate and morally ambiguous nature. As a consequence of the fall, Mad Max's journey literally took him from a rookie cop with a tragic past to a lone drifter, and by the time of Beyond Thunderdome, he'd become almost a subject of legends and mythology amongst the inhabitants of the wasteland. In this harsh post-apocalyptic world, people are eager for heroes and saviors, so smart people like Immortan Joe exploit this need by seizing power for himself and establishing his own hierarchy. In a way, this approach also lets the Mad Max series touch on real-world socio-political issues, even with its over-the-top villains in a post-apocalyptic backdrop. George Miller's original film was meant as a warning about how society might react to fuel shortages, but as the franchise progressed, it explored themes like misogyny and resource hoarding. So, the introduction of the History Men serves as a way for the series to suggest that the fascism that once ruled the Citadel will struggle to make a comeback, and these History Men will be the ones to document it as a cautionary tale for the future.
You cannot own a human being. Sooner or later, someone pushes back.
Before the History Man came into play, George Miller first explored the idea of unreliable mythological storytelling in The Road Warrior. In this film, the narration was voiced by Harold Bajan, who comes from an older version of the Feral Kid, played by Emil Minty. Even though the movie was known as Mad Max 2 in some regions, and Mel Gibson returned as Max Rokitansky, the narration made it quite clear that what we were seeing was a larger-than-life version of the story, rather than a straightforward factual account of the fall of civilization. Again, in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, a part of the story was narrated by members of the tribe who left. This film marked a shift in George Miller's approach, where casting choices were more about serving the characters and the story, rather than sticking to a conventional continuity. For instance, Bruce Spence returned as Jedediah, an airline pilot, but he wasn't the same character as the gyro captain from Mad Max 2, even though Spence did play both roles. This casting choice basically upheld a mirror that showed Miller's intent to create a similar archetype without trying to link the characters directly. Even though Mel Gibson played Max in the first 3 films, Tom Hardy took over the role in 2015's Fury Road. While this change was likely influenced by practical considerations as much as by creative choices, it continued the theme of unreliable narrators in the series, because here, Max himself admits to being somewhat unhinged. This often results in familiar faces appearing different or vice versa. Unlike other franchises like in Iron Man 2, where Don Cheadle had to address his new look directly due to continuity reasons, the Mad Max films embrace this kind of change with a certain berserk boldness. Now, given that Charlize Theron's portrayal of Furiosa in Fury Road was such a standout, it was no surprise that George Miller wanted to explore her backstory with a prequel. After all, a full draft of the script had already been completed during the long development of Fury Road. But what came as a surprise, though, was the decision to not have Theron reprise her role in Furiosa. Instead, the film featured Alila Brown and Anya Taylor-Joy as the younger versions of Furiosa, respectively portraying her as a child and a young adult. It's really interesting how George Miller approaches his casting in the Mad Max films, because in Furiosa, he's pulled off a sort of casting hat trick. Instead of using de-aging technology to cast Theron as Furiosa, he cast Alila and Anya to play her as a younger woman, thus sticking to his unconventional casting methods. The film also sees Lockie Hume stepping in as Immortan Joe, taking over the role from Hugh Keys-Byrne, who had passed away in 2020. Apart from that, there were some other familiar faces too, as Angus Sampson was back as the organic mechanic, and Josh Hellman, who played Warboy Slit in Fury Road, was now portraying Joe's son, Scrotus. Basically, the whole shifting of actors and characters in the Mad Max saga really plays into the mythic quality of the story. And in Furiosa, Miller shakes things up by starting the plot with a portrayal of the History Man, who kicks off the story with a sort of grand introduction. Throughout the movie, we see the History Man popping up time and again to share various facts, even though many of them seem a bit off. By the time we reach the climax, he even goes so far as to claim that out of several possible endings, only one is the real deal, even if we see 4 different ones, which leaves us questioning whether we should in fact take his word as the ultimate gospel or not. Miller turns History Man into the in-universe reason for why some characters look different from time to time, while others seem familiar, even if they're not quite the same. This approach, through the portrayal of History Man, pretty much makes it clear that the Mad Max films are not meant to be a single rigid story with strict continuity. Instead, they form one big evolving oral history of the wasteland, and just like any great myth, it's not the exact details that matter, but the message behind them.
The one day, 6th day, 1,000-day wars.
Does History Man know all the real-life events? During Immortan Joe and Furiosa's collective assault on Dementus and his horde in the prequel film, we hear the History Man narrating many famous conflicts that have actually occurred in real life throughout the course of history, starting with the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses was a series of civil wars fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York from May 22, 1455 to June 16, 1487 for control of the English throne. The conflict got its name from the heraldic symbols of the two houses, which were the red rose for Lancaster and the white rose for York. Both of them were cadet branches of the ruling House of Plantagenet. Although the House of Lancaster ultimately won the war, it marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty's 300-year rule over England. The last Plantagenet king, Richard III, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. It was this victory that paved the way for the House of Tudor, led by King Henry VII, to ascend to the throne. The Tudor dynasty began with Henry VII's reign, which lasted from 1485 until his death on April 21, 1509, and ended with Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch who ruled from 1558 until her death on March 24, 1603. The War of the Oranges. The War of the Oranges was a brief conflict fought between the armed forces of France and Spain against Portugal from May 20th to June 9th, 1801. The war began when French and Spanish forces invaded Portugal after the country refused to cede their territory to Spain and break off its alliance with Great Britain in 1800. Although the War of the Oranges ended with a combined victory for France and Spain in Europe, forcing Portugal to cede the town of Olivenza near the Spanish border to Spain, it was a completely different story in South America. There, Portugal secured a win and managed to expand its territory in Brazil. These outcomes were formalized under the Treaty of Badajoz, signed on June 6, 1801, which both recognized Spain's control of Olivenza and confirmed Portugal's territorial gains in Brazil. The War of the Oranges is also considered part of the broader War of the Second Coalition, which lasted from November 29, 1799 to March 25, 1802, and is seen as a precursor to the Peninsular War in Europe, which took place from October 27, 1807 to April 17, 1814. The Opium Wars. The Opium Wars are connected to two different conflicts which were fought between the Chinese Qing dynasty and the Western powers back in the 19th century. The First Opium War was fought between Great Britain and the Qing dynasty from September 4, 1839 to August 29, 1842. The conflict arose due to China's attempts to restrict the opium trade, which had grown significantly as British merchants sold large quantities of the drug to Chinese smugglers. The war ended with a British victory, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty had significant consequences as it ceded Hong Kong to Britain and opened 5 Chinese ports to British trade, marking a turning point in China's relationship with the West. Later, the Second Opium War was fought between the combined forces of Britain, France, Russia, and the United States against the Qing dynasty from October 8, 1856 to October 24, 1860. The conflict arose as Western powers sought to further expand their influence in China and control the opium trade. It goes without saying that, like the First Opium War, this conflict also ended in a victory for the Western powers. The Opium Wars concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking. These agreements had significant outcomes as Britain gained control of the Kowloon Peninsula and Stonecutters Island as part of Hong Kong, while Russia acquired Outer Manchuria. The Six-Day War. The Six-Day War was a brief but intense conflict fought between Israel and the Arab coalition of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan from June 5th to June 10th, 1967. Israel won this war and seized the important territories of the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, along with the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. This war dramatically reshaped the map of the Middle East and had lasting impacts on the region. It basically opened a wound that's not been festering till this day. Not just that, the Six-Day War also led to significant displacement of civilian populations, with around 280 to 325,000 Palestinians and 100,000 Syrians fleeing or being expelled from the West Bank and the Golan Heights, respectively. The aftermath of Israel's victory was deeply felt across the Arab world. As a result, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser resigned in disgrace, but widespread protests in Egypt eventually led to his reinstatement. Additionally, in the wake of the conflict, Egypt closed the Suez Canal, which remained shut until 1975. The Thousand Days War. The Thousand Days War was a civil conflict in Colombia that raged from October 17, 1899 to November 21, 1902 between the Colombian national government, which was being controlled by the National Party, and the Colombian Liberal Party. The Thousand Days War in Colombia was fueled by a long-standing ideological struggle between federalism and centralism, involving the liberals, conservatives, and nationalists. Tensions escalated after the implementation of the Constitution of 1886 and the political movement known as the Regeneration. The situation came to a head after the contentious presidential election of 1898. On October 17, 1899, members of the Liberal Party in the departments of Santander officially declared an insurrection against the national government, and the hostilities began on November 11th, when Liberal forces attempt to seize the city of Bucaramanga, which then sparked a 3-year-long conflict. The war concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Neerlandia and the Treaty of Wisconsin, leading to a conservative victory. This victory solidified the Conservative Party's dominance in Colombian politics for the next 28 years, and Colombia's political structure as a unitary state has remained unchallenged since then. Even if the national government had won, the war had profound consequences. Not just that, the Thousand Days War in Colombia also spilled over into neighboring Ecuador and Venezuela, with conservative and liberal factions in those countries, as well as in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, supporting their respective allies within Colombia. The conflict attracted international attention, particularly from the United States, which had significant interests in the Panama Isthmus. So, under the pretext of upholding the Mayorino-Bidlack Treaty, the US intervened by deploying its naval forces in Panama, which was then still a part of Colombia. The Thousand Days War was the deadliest and most destructive conflict in Colombia's history, claiming an estimated number ranging from 100,000 to 180,000 lives, which was about 2.5% to 3.8% of the nation's population at the time. Apart from leading to the dissolution of the National Party, the war had devastating consequences, including a partial collapse of the economy, ongoing governmental instability, and ultimately the loss of Panama. This war ultimately contributed to the full independence of Panama, which became an independent nation on November 3, 1903. It really left deep scars on the country, with long-lasting and irreversible economic, political, and social impacts. Now, in the same scene where the history man spoke about the more recent historical conflicts of the world, he also mentioned references of a few ancient historical wars. The Sumer-Elam War, which took place around 2600 BC between the Sumerians and the Elamites in what is now modern-day Iran and Iraq, is one of the earliest recorded instances of warfare. Although details about the conflict are scarce, it's often regarded as the first documented case of war in human history. The war between the Saxons and the Vikings. This war began with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which was fought on September 25, 1066, and pitted the Anglo-Saxon forces of King Harold Godwinson against the Viking army led by Harold Hardrada, with support from Harold's brother, Tostig Godwinson, the Earl of Northumbria. As the name suggests, the battle took place at Stamford Bridge in the East Riding of Yorkshire. After the Anglo-Saxons emerged victorious, it marked the end of the Viking presence in Great Britain and Ireland, something that had endured since the Viking invasion of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumberland in 793. Although the Anglo-Saxon victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge ended the existence of the Vikings in Britain and Ireland, it was rather short-lived. Just weeks later, on October 14, 1066, the Anglo-Saxons were defeated by the forces of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, at the Battle of Hastings. This defeat ultimately led to the death of King Harold Godwinson and marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon era in England. At the end, William the Conqueror was crowned as the first Norman king of England, unifying the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single Kingdom of England. The American Civil War. The history man referred to this war as the struggle between the North and the South. So, the American Civil War was fought between the Union forces of the northern United States and the Confederate forces of the South from April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865. To this day, the causes of the Civil War remain a topic of debate among politicians and scholars, with many discussions centering on whether the primary motivation was actually to end slavery, which was deeply entrenched in the Southern economy back then. During the American Civil War, the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln, who also served as the Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces, delivered his iconic Gettysburg speech on November 19, 1863. But as the conflict neared its end, Lincoln was tragically shot by a Southern Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the evening of April 14, 1865. As the president was mortally wounded, he died the following day on April 15th. After this, in an intense manhunt, Lincoln's assassin was eventually located in a barn at Port Royal, Virginia. On April 26, 1865, Booth was shot and killed by Sergeant Thomas Boston Corbett of the U.S. Army, who was of English descent. This ultimately marked the end of Booth's escape and the resolution of one of the most infamous episodes in American history. President Lincoln's Gettysburg speech would later become a powerful touchstone for the U.S. civil rights movement in the 1960s. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced Lincoln's speech during his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which he delivered at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington rally on August 28, 1963. King's speech drew on Lincoln's vision to underscore the ongoing struggle for civil rights and equality ongoing in America for a long time. The Cold War. Although the history man cleverly referenced it as the war between the East and the West, the Cold War was actually a time of heightened geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies who were called the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. It began in 1947, exactly 2 years after World War II ended, and continued until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The term Cold War basically reflects the fact that there was no direct large-scale fighting between the two superpowers. Instead, they supported opposing sides in various regional conflicts, known as proxy wars. In reality, the Cold War was driven by a struggle for global influence between two major superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stemming from their roles as Allied powers in World War II, which led to the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945. This period was marked by a competition for dominance that went beyond just nuclear arms and military deployments. It included psychological warfare, propaganda, espionage, embargoes, sports diplomacy, and technological races like the space race. The Cold War officially began with the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. It started to wind down with the Sino-Soviet split in 1961, which saw a rift between the Soviets and the People's Republic of China. This war ultimately ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union on 26th of December, 1991. Now, at the end of the same scene, the history man spoke about various conflicts which arose in history due to a clash in religious ideologies and righteous beliefs. Let's start. The Soga-Mononobe conflict. The Soga-Mononobe conflict was a significant political and military struggle in Japan during the Asuka period. It was fought between two powerful clans, the pro-Buddhist Soga clan, led by Soga no Umako, and the pro-Shinto Mononobe clan, led by Mononobe no Moriya. The conflict began around 552 and continued until 587. In the end, the Soga clan emerged victorious, which led to the downfall of the Mononobe clan. This victory not only cemented the influence of Buddhism in Japan, but also marked the ultimate dissolution of the Mononobe clan's power. The Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religious wars fought between the European Christians and the Middle Eastern Muslims in the Holy Lands from 1096 to 1291. It was led by the Christian Latin Church during the medieval period, with the goal of recapturing Jerusalem and the surrounding areas from Muslim control. This territory had been under Muslim rule since the Rashidun Caliphate's conquest centuries earlier. The First Crusade, which began in 1096, successfully captured Jerusalem in 1099. Over the next few centuries, numerous military campaigns followed, making the Crusades a significant focus of European history. However, interest in crusading waned rapidly after the 15th century. Later, in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade during the Council of Clermont, responding to a request for help from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. He urged Europeans to embark on an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This appeal sparked a lot of enthusiastic support across Western Europe, with people from all walks of life joining in. They were driven by various motivations, including religious devotion, the desire to fulfill feudal obligations, the chance for personal glory, and opportunities for economical or political gain. As the Crusades continued, later expeditions were typically led by more organized armies, often commanded by kings, and all participants were promised papal indulgences. These initial successes led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states, which were the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli. The European presence in the region lasted until the fall of Acre in 1291, after which no major military campaigns were launched. The Hussite Wars. The Hussite Wars were fought between the Protestant Hussite movement and the Catholic forces led by Pope Sigismund of Luxembourg. This conflict took place in Central Europe from July 30th, 1419 to May 30th, 1434. During the war, the Hussite movement split into 2 different factions. The moderate Hussites, who eventually aligned with Sigismund's forces, and the radical Hussites, who came to be known as the Taborites. The war ended with a victory for Sigismund's forces, establishing him as king of Bohemia. This settlement allowed the moderate Hussites to continue practicing their faith while ending the challenge of the radical Hussites. The Hussite community included a large portion of the Czech population in the Kingdom of Bohemia, became a significant and spontaneous military force. These wars were said to be remarkable for their innovative use of early handheld firearms, like hand cannons, and for the Hussites' creative use of wagon forts, which played a crucial role in their military strategy. The Ethiopian Adal War. The Ethiopian Adal War is also known as the Abyssinian Adal War. It was a conflict fought between the pro-Christian Ethiopian Empire and the Portuguese Empire against the Islamic Adal Sultanate and the Ottoman Empire in Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Ethiopian forces included people from the Amhara, Tigrayans, Tigrinya, and Agor. By the end of the war, they were supported by the Portuguese, who sent around 400 musketeers. On the other side, the Adal forces were made up of Harla, Somali, Afar, as well as Arab and Turkish gunmen. At various times during the conflict, Maya mercenaries also joined both sides. The English Civil War. The English Civil War was a series of conflicts and political struggles between the Royalists, who supported the monarchy, and the Parliamentarians, who sought more power for Parliament. These wars took place in the Kingdom of England from 1642 to 1651 and were part of the broader Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which also included the conflicts in Scotland and Ireland. The English Civil War itself is divided into the First and Second English Civil Wars, while the Anglo-Scottish War from 1650 to 1652 is sometimes considered as the Third English Civil War. Although the conflicts in England, Scotland, and Ireland during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms had some common themes, each region had its own unique issues and goals. The First English Civil War, which took place from 1642 to 1646, was mainly about deciding the proper balance of power between Parliament and King Charles I. It concluded in June 1646 with the defeat of the Royalists and the king being taken into custody. But their victory in the First English Civil War revealed deep divisions among the parliamentarians, who then began to struggle on how the political future of England should be handled. Most parliamentarians had gone to war in 1642 just to ensure that the Parliament had a role in government, not to overthrow the monarchy. But King Charles I's refusal to compromise led to a deadlock. The fears about the growing influence of radicals in the new model army, such as Oliver Cromwell, led to an alliance between more moderate parliamentarians and royalists, with support from the Covenanters. Ultimately, the defeat of the Royalists in the Second English Civil War in 1648 resulted in Charles I's execution in January 1649 and the establishment of the Commonwealth of England. Following that, in 1650, Charles II was crowned King of Scotland on the condition that he'd establish a Presbyterian church in both England and Scotland. The following Anglo-Scottish War ended with a parliamentarian victory at the Battle of Worcester on September 3, 1651. As a result, both Ireland and Scotland were brought into the Commonwealth, making Britain a unified state until the Stuart Restoration in 1660. The Greek War of Independence. The Greek War of Independence was fought between Greek revolutionaries and the Ottoman Empire from February 21, 1821 to September 12, 1829. In 1826, the Greeks received support from the British Empire, France, and Russia, while the Ottomans were assisted by their North African vassals. The conflict ended with a Greek victory and led to the establishment of Greece as an independent nation. The war eventually led to the creation of modern Greece, which expanded to its current borders in the years that followed. Greeks around the world celebrate their Independence Day on March 25th to mark the significance of the Greek Revolution. So, that sums up almost every war that the history man had mentioned in Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. While it may not seem it at first, if you watch all the Mad Max films and read the comics, you'll understand just how this character plays a huge role in the overarching narrative of the franchise. Like I've discussed before, understanding history is crucial for educating the younger generation. When this doesn't happen, we end up with situations like the Lost Tribe in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, who created their own makeshift history, or the Tell, from certain fragmented memories, rumors, and scavenged items. In Thunderdome, this invented mythology often leads to false hopes and inaction, as the tribe remains stuck in their small oasis in the wasteland, simply waiting to be rescued. When the younger generation isn't properly taught, they may create new, often confusing terms for everyday things, as shown in Furiosa. The biggest example was when the biker horde of Dementors saw a signal flare in the sky and learned from a random warboy that it was called Sky Blood. Basically, without the history man providing proper historical knowledge to the future, societies can further slip into savagery, where misunderstandings and superstitions start to shape their beliefs and guide their actions. With that being said, what are your thoughts on the history men? Should they play a bigger role in the upcoming Mad Max projects? Let us know about your thoughts and theories in the comment box below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.